I'm Peter Curti, Research Fellow at the Centre for Independent Studies. When the Commonwealth Attorney General Nicola Roxon introduced an exposure draft of the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Bill in November last year, it met with a mixed response. Some welcomed the changes, which included broadening the definition of discrimination, but others were less enthusiastic and feared that if the bill were to become law, political correctness would have triumphed and freedom of speech in Australia would be diminished. One such critic of the bill is former Chief Justice of New South Wales and now ABC Chairman, the Honourable James Spigelman, who has come to the Centre for Independent Studies today to defend the right to offend. Jim Spigelman, welcome to the CIS.
Thank you.
Is freedom of speech an absolute right, do you think?
Well, it's never been an absolute right. It's obviously cut down, for example, by defamation laws in terms of defence of reputation. Confidentiality requirements of contractual or statutory character have often been applied. So there's always have been exceptions. Perhaps the classic example that's often that goes back to for over a century is that no one has a right to cry fire in a crowded cinema. That's a restriction, if you like, on freedom of speech for very, very good reasons because of the consequences of speech in that context. The difficulty has always been to know how to find an appropriate balance whenever speech impinges upon other values and other rights. And that's not an issue with a single correct answer.
So anti-discrimination legislation in principle, it seeks to go into those areas beyond which defamation law and the other kinds of law that you have described have an impact.
Yes, the facts are that hate speech has consequences which we know are adverse to social cohesion and can lead to violence. And there have been many alternative formulations of restrictions on hate speech directed at people because of their race or gender or sexual orientation and the like. That's something that has grown over recent decades. The hate speech based on racial vilification is the one with the longest history. And there is an issue now about the cumulative effect of all of these progressively added restrictions on speech that have come into focus by reason of this recent Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Bill, which is seeking to draw all of those threads together and reflect them in a single omnibus regime.
And you actually took quite a trenchant and, in the end, very effective stand against the attempt to make it an offence to offend. What was your objection to that?
Well, I just thought that that went too far. The legislation talked about it being presumptively discriminatory to say something which offends, insults. I thought those went too far, and also humiliate and intimidate. And I could see an argument for saying that that kind of restriction in a hate context may be justified, but I said there's no such thing as a right not to be offended. And offensive speech is in fact an essential part of our public debate and discourse generally. So that particular provision the government has announced it will not be proceeding with, and the whole of the Act is now subject to review.
Another provision which struck me as odd was the proposal to reverse the burden of proof. Do you think that marked or if it were to be implemented, would mark a dramatic shift in contemporary jurisprudence?
It's something that it does exist in some of the predecessor legislation, and I'm not sure if it would be a dramatic shift, but there's no doubt it is a shift. One of the things about that proposal was that it was announced as merely a consolidating statute, except in one or two identified respects. Well, it was a lot more than just a consolidating statute. And that was one of the reasons why it was open to such criticism.
Let me ask you about the impact that the bill might have on freedom of religion in particular. What kind of freedom is freedom of religion, and how would the bill impact that freedom?
Well, at the moment it was proposing to continue the exemptions for religious organisations in contexts like not employing people because of because they were homosexual and matters of that character. They are extant in the existing sex discrimination legislation and the other pre-existing acts. That was one of the things that was criticised, and as I recall, the parliamentary committee which looked at this bill said that no, that exemption for religious organisations should not continue to exist. That's also one of the matters that is back under review. I'm not quite sure where that's likely to go.
Is freedom of religion something that society needs to defend by means of legislation, or can it be left to the mores and customs of that society?
Well, that's really getting into the Bill of Rights type debate. Do we need a Bill of Rights? What we now have is we don't have that, but in those jurisdictions of a similar character that have something like a Bill of Rights, including now England and Canada, not just the United States, freedom of religion, freedom of speech are acknowledged. Questions of anti-discrimination law impinge on both. And there's no right balance in that respect, and there's no right answer to where you draw that line. And it's something that different societies draw in different ways, and that one society draws in different ways at different times.
We're now in an election year. What do you think the current state, and heading for a budget session, what do you think the current status of the bill is as the government prepares now to go to the polls?
I would be quite surprised if this new rewritten bill is prepared in time for the budget session. That will probably mean that it cannot be enacted. It may be introduced before the election. I mean, that's just it's not an assumption, it's not based on any knowledge, but it would be hard, given the time constraints of a short parliamentary session, for that bill to re-emerge before the election at least in an enacted form. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely.
Jim Spigelman, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.